Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna... Okay, all you citizens of the world, welcome back to Live from the Heartland for the week of September 26th. And my next guest is actually going to be the host for the last segment of this show. He's the one and only Euan Hague, and he and I first met when we had the Heartland Cafe, and Euan was a customer. And then we went on to teach together for 10 years at DePaul. We taught a class called Activists and Activism since 1960. And Euan is now, I believe, the assistant dean. He was head of the director of School of Public Service at DePaul. He's a wonderful guy who's been on the show before, and he was talking to me about a fellow named Andrew Kahrl, who has a new book out called The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. And we thought that would be a good segment for the show. And I said, well, I need a host every now and then, so why don't you practice up? So Euan, you take over. I'm going to lay back in the cut and just check how you guys are doing.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us as well, Andrew. It's really great to be able to talk to you. I'm looking forward. I know you're visiting Chicago in a couple of weeks' time to talk about your book, The Black Tax. I can show people here, which is published by University of Chicago Press. And I should actually introduce you as a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Virginia. Although there is a lot of stuff about Chicago in this book as well, so I think that's really great. But maybe why don't you just give us a quick introduction to what is the Black Tax?
Yeah, so my book is really a history of taxation in America as told from the perspectives and experiences of Black Americans. And in particular, I look at the role of local tax systems in both, fueling and exacerbating racial inequality over, really throughout, American history. And, in particular, my book looks at and shines a spotlight on three interrelated problems. One, the historic and ongoing overtaxation of African-American homes, land, and neighborhoods through property taxes. Secondly, the unequal distribution of public revenues, the tax dollars that are collected by local governments and the spending practices of local governments, especially when it comes to schools. And third is the system of tax delinquency enforcement, namely the fact that most states allow for local governments to sell unpaid tax debts to private investors who can then earn interest and charge fees on those debts that are often set at exorbitantly high rates. And if those property owners fail to pay within a certain time frame, they can take their property and all that it's worth. And this has historically been one of the causal factors behind not just the struggles of African American homeowners to build wealth, but also to hold on to their property, and has been a factor in the precipitous decline of Black land ownership over the 20th century, from upwards of 16 million acres in the early 1900s down to below 5 million acres by the end of the 20th century. So all of these have been studied by some legal experts. They've been the subject of activism at the local level, but they've never really been brought together as my book aims to do, and show how all three of these problems are related to each other, and how they've quietly but powerfully been a force for racial inequality and injustice, and continue to do so till this day.
It's kind of, your book talks a lot about, and your work talks a lot about these kind of structures of dispossession. It's ways that we have built this into our legal taxation system that has these impacts. And you actually start in the Reconstruction era with the dispossession of what the freedmen inherited and were granted in that era right after the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's from the moment African Americans begin becoming property owners and following the overthrow of Reconstruction era governments, we begin to see the manipulation of local tax administrative practices, sort of local tax assessors who are overvaluing Black-owned acres, undervaluing the richest farmland in the South, and sort of shifting local tax burdens onto Black citizens as part of a broader set of practices that we often associate with Jim Crow in the South. And so this is one area that has really been flown under the radar from historians for generations now, is the powers of taxation, the powers that and the susceptibility of those powers to abuse.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the examples in the book, which are about Chicago specifically. Right throughout, obviously, Chicago's history, we've dealt with issues of racial covenants and restrictive practices on where the African-American population can live. And you talk about there's almost an environmental justice aspect with the campaigns against pollution in the 1970s. So there's what in a nutshell would be some of the kind of takeaways from your analyses of how these practices have impacted Chicago's communities?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it will come to no surprise to your listeners that there's a history of political corruption within the Cook County Assessor's Office. One that I should mention that the current assessor, Fritz Kahrl, has been taking real significant strides toward cleaning up and addressing. But really, again, the African Americans, as you begin to see the boundaries around Black neighborhoods form and harden, as we begin to see this process of ghettoization take shape in the early 20th century alongside of the growth of the city's Black population, you begin to see as well these patterns of over and under assessment begin to become a feature of property taxation across Cook County. That the South Side and then later the West Side were suffering from exorbitantly high property taxes. These were also neighborhoods that were chronically underserved by local government when it comes to public goods and services, when it comes to public schools. And then thirdly, in Chicago, and this is something I really kind of shine a spotlight on, you have the emergence of this whole sort of class of investors who have exploited the tax sale laws in Illinois, which really allow for predatory investors to accumulate riches at the expense of some of the most vulnerable homeowners, and have resulted in the stripping of property and wealth from disproportionately Black and brown neighborhoods. And so this is something that I sort of bring into the frame when it comes to what we know about the history of segregation. We know about the history of racial covenants, redlining. Thanks to incredible books like Beryl Satter's book on family properties, we know about the impact of contract sales. But taxes and tax policy and these practices were shaping and worsening all of those problems. And in fact, actually, when it comes to, say, some of these other predatory practices like contract sales, these tax buyers, the people who were investing in tax liens, these were the same people, literally. I mean, they were moving from one scam to the next. And the real chilling thing about something like, say, tax sales and the African Americans who are victimized by this, and I tell their stories in this in my book, is that these were folks by and large the people who are most vulnerable to falling into delinquency on their taxes and then falling prey to these predatory investors are people who've actually paid off their mortgages or bought their homes outright. Who've maybe lived in those homes for generations, disproportionately, these are also, elderly people. So these are a really particularly vulnerable class of homeowners who've been victimized by this. And, again, this is one where, it's, at the other end, we see this is a thriving, today, tax lien investing is a multi-billion-dollar industry with a significant number of lobbyists down in Springfield who are fighting to protect their own interest. And, this is, as I sort of point out at the beginning of the book and return to at the end, while this is a history, this is not these are not problems of the past. These are ongoing, very much unresolved issues. We continue to see the overassessment of neighborhoods. We continue to see the problems with these tax sales.
And I think you really humanize it. And I think I just encourage people to read, even if you're just sitting. It'd be wonderful if everyone bought and read the whole book, but but the introduction, you really humanize it with the story of these two women in Jean Wright and Elizabeth Milton in Long Island, who thought they were doing everything right as good homeowners, paying their property taxes on time, and then for really small amounts of hundreds of dollars, not thousands, just a couple of $100s, they literally lost the house that they believed they owned.
Yeah, and I think one of my goals in writing this book is when I first started doing research on this subject, I was not a tax expert. In fact, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, when I would have said taxes are a boring subject. Who wants to read a book about taxes? And they're also not like really a human type. So they're not a subject that lends itself to human stories, but one of the things I discovered is actually you can humanize this history by focusing on the people who are affected by these laws and policies. By really sort of centering human experiences, you can then begin to explain these complex processes, these laws and procedures that oftentimes can seem sort of abstract and opaque. They start to actually kind of come into focus and make sense when you actually look at it through the experiences of people who are struggling within this, very unjust and unfair system. And so that was one of the goals. And I'll sort of say to all listeners, this is a book that is written so that, a person who's never studied taxes before, who knows nothing about this subject, can pick up the book and understand what the history is that I'm describing, and hopefully begin to appreciate the severity of these problems and the urgency to take action against them.
Could you just give us an example of how somebody loses their house? Just walk me through the step by step. What happens?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example from my book, and this is from Chicago. I tell this story of Louis Balthasar. He was an African-American man who migrated to Chicago from Louisiana after World War II. He purchased a house on the west side, actually a 3-flat apartment. He lived in the first downstairs apartment, had a large family, 10 children. And at some point in the late 1950s and early 60s, he fell into hard times. And he was also a World War II veteran. He was suffering from illnesses. He was, spent a period of time in the VA hospital. And during that time where he was in the hospital, a property tax bill arrived at their house. It went unpaid. He was also out of work, and so when the notice came that the bill was past due, he didn't have the money to pay it, and then unbeknownst to him, Cook County sold that debt to an investor at the Cook County tax lien sale, and the person who purchased that then began charging interest on it, and the bill began to grow exponentially. And to the point where eventually when the expiration date came and Balthasar was unable to pay it, the person who bought that debt, an attorney by the name of Alan Blair, who was one of the largest tax lien buyers in the city, a guy who was made millions of dollars just again taking advantage of people like Louis Balthasar, he claimed the deed to that property. And here's the other thing. Here's what he did next. He then threatened to evict Balthasar, but if he didn't agree to, not contest this deed and to essentially begin paying him rent for the house that he had thought he owned. This case was then taken up. This went all the way up to the federal courts, and the federal courts upheld that ruling and allowed Blair to keep this property. And again, it began with a person who fell on hard times, was in a situation where they were unable to pay a tax bill. He was also sort of unfamiliar with a lot of the legalese in these documents that they were receiving. And by the time he was able to figure out what was going on and the severity of the situation, it was too late. This guy owned his home, and Balthasar literally had to buy it back from him. So again, this is just these kind of, and this was happening to hundreds of people across Chicago each year, sometimes more, and continues to happen to this day.
Yeah, and it happens U.S.-wide. We're focusing on Chicago, obviously, but This is happening throughout the United States. I'm thinking, I know there's got to be not just from your book, but there's going to be activism and resistance and sort of, I'm thinking of organizations. I know we have like a group like the Metropolitan Tenants Organization, which is a slightly different group, but we have groups here in Chicago that deal with housing issues. There must be civil rights attorneys, housing activists who are engaged in this. Are they successful, or do we have situations like the case you just mentioned where the courts come down on the side of the tax buyer?
Yeah, I mean, this is another part of the story that my book tells is the struggles to mount movements for change, for legal changes to the ways in which local governments administer and enforce property tax collection. And one of the challenges and obstacles, which remains in place to this day, is the fact that you as a local taxpayer can get no relief through the federal courts. There is Congress passed a law in 1937 that essentially closed the federal courthouse doors to lawsuits, federal lawsuits challenging local tax practices. Now, that decision was the move by Congress to do that was not, did not contemplate the effects that would have, say, on vulnerable homeowners or victims of discriminatory taxation. It was actually aimed at cracking down on corporate tax avoidance, which I'd argue is a good thing. But in doing so, it did inadvertently, prevent victims of these types of discriminatory overtaxation in particular from being able to contest these practices in federal courts. To essentially, they can only sort of seek justice at the state and local level. This matters, especially when in the chapters where I talk about the civil rights movement in the South, where you had, local governments that were routinely, punishing Black activists and civil rights organizations through jacking up their property taxes, through removing tax exemptions, through doing all sorts of manner of sort of, messing with the local tax laws in order to, retaliate and intimidate movement activists. And while there was attempts by legal groups to challenge these practices, they were never able to crack open the federal courthouse doors. And those practices, that sort of use of tax policies and practices as a weapon against movement activists, that remains in place to this day. So, that's, again, a sort of another sort of part of this story is the challenge of building a national scale level movement against these very local practices. Mm-hmm. The other challenge as well is, especially when it comes to, say, tax delinquency laws, is that the laws vary from state to state. Illinois' law is different from Wisconsin's, is different from Michigan's. So as well, it's hard to kind of, mount movements on that front as well. So very much like the story, one of the parts of the story I tell is these local campaigns, and Chicago as being one where you've been able to see progress happening at the local level, but it's been difficult to scale that up to the national level. One of the goals of my book was, and this was one of the challenges in writing this, is telling a national story of these local practices. But one of the things I try to do from the outset is make clear that these are not sort of isolated problems, that while the particulars might vary from state to state and city to city, there is a broader pattern here that I really try to shine a light on.
Right. And I think the tag on the book, or it says you estimate that this is the sort of structural removal of $600 billion from the African American inherited wealth nationwide. I mean, that's a staggering amount of money, and that must have long-term impacts.
Yeah, and I would say that is a very, very conservative estimate. I was trying not to, throw out a number there that would not, would be anything, greater than what I could, sort of estimate. And if you think about, the fact that, to this day, by the latest estimate, given the patterns of overtaxation that Black neighborhoods continue to experience, which one team of economists recently estimated average out to every Black household in America is paying upwards of $400 more each year in property taxes than they should. If you just take that number and go back to, say, the late 1800s, given the fact that my book pretty convincingly shows that these patterns of over-assessment have been haunting Black Americans, from the moment they began acquiring property, just that number alone should give you an indication of just the scale. If you add that up for every year going back the past 150 years, and then couple that with just the staggering amount of land and wealth that has been stolen through these tax sales. If you're talking about, we're talking about over 10 million acres that was lost over the course of the 20th century, and it was not all lost due to tax sales, but taxes were either a primary or proximate factor in much of that loss. It was either a tax bill that one couldn't pay that sort of was the opening sort of stages of dispossession, or it was quite directly the tax sale itself. And that's also not accounting for all the untold numbers of people who were able to save their property, who were able to redeem it. And to be clear, most people who fall into tax delinquency, most homeowners are eventually able to settle their debts and keep their home. But they are suffering massive financial losses to do so because of the way these laws are structured. I mean, in Illinois, the interest rate can jump to upwards of 48% over 2 years. So that debt, again, a $100 tax bill can quickly, metastasize into something much greater. And again, to think about what, the fact that African-American neighborhoods and communities are disproportionately affected by this, you begin to see how, maybe that 600 billion is actually a very, very low estimate if you think about that.
Yeah, and you see the resulting, as you mentioned right at the start, the disinvestment in some neighborhoods. The tax money gets sucked out, but not reinvested in. Oh, absolutely. And I know there's, and of course in Chicago, we have the history. I mean, when Martin Luther King comes here, housing is a critical issue, right? He's really pushing without Raby on fair housing, equal housing. At the same time, you have the federal government subsidizing loans in the suburbs for white families. And you have this dispossession. Well, at that stage also, many African Americans were contract buying. They could not actually own property in the city until the late 1960s. So you have these sort of simultaneous movements creating the foundations of the housing inequality landscape that we have today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, again, another interesting thing I found, when Martin Luther King came to Chicago, part of that Northern campaign, and he stayed on the West Side in a rundown apartment building. I found actually in the courts doing research that actually that apartment building was owned by one of the city's largest tax buyers. I mean, they are sort of engaging in all manner of speculation on properties in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So, quietly, these folks, I mean, again, like, these actors have been kind of hovering in the shadows for generations and quietly siphoning off wealth and income from the most disadvantaged families and communities. And have, one of the things I really aim to do is sort of shine a spotlight on these practices so we can begin to get a clearer sense here of what is actually perpetuating inequality so that we can then begin to devise effective strategies for countering it.
It's a fascinating book, The Black Tax. 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America, published by University of Chicago Press. Andrew Kahrl, the author, thanks for being with us. What are you working on next?
Well, I mean, I'm working a lot on sort of looking at, the laws and policies today, and some of the there's particular legal cases that are working their way through the courts. There's a lot of sort of push for reforming tax sale laws in Illinois in particular right now. I'd encourage your listeners to be following that closely. And so I'm sort of really trying to sort of take what I wrote in this book and begin to apply it to the political issues of the day.